When most people think of Vikings, they conjure images of horned helmets and longships cutting through icy waters, but the reality of Viking life, and particularly their raids, was far darker and more brutal than popular culture suggests. The Viking Age, roughly spanning from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, was a period marked by relentless expansion, exploration, and most notoriously, violent incursions across Europe. While they were accomplished sailors, traders, and craftsmen, the Vikings' reputation as ferocious raiders was well earned, particularly for the havoc they wreaked on the communities they attacked. Among their targets, the fate of women, especially the wives of defeated enemies, was particularly harrowing, reflecting a combination of opportunism, social norms, and sheer cruelty. Viking raids were meticulously planned, though from the outside, they could appear sudden and unpredictable. Villages along the coasts and rivers of what are now England, France, and the British Isles were particularly vulnerable. The longships, sleek, shallow draft vessels capable of traversing both open seas and narrow rivers, allowed Vikings to strike with lightning speed. Many communities had little warning, leaving their populations defenseless. The men often fought or were slaughtered, but the women, children, and elderly were frequently captured, taken as hostages, or enslaved. The very presence of these raiders inspired terror. Chronicles from monasteries describe monks fleeing in terror at the sound of the dragon-headed longships approaching, knowing that once the Vikings landed, no one would be safe from their brutality. The initial assault during a Viking raid was designed to shock and overwhelm. Historians often note that the first wave of violence wasn't random, it served a psychological purpose. By demonstrating complete dominance, Vikings intended to break the morale of the survivors, making them easier to control and exploit. Men were killed or executed in gruesome ways to prevent resistance, and houses and granaries were burned to the ground, leaving survivors in despair. Against this backdrop of terror, the women of these communities faced the most precarious position. While men could die fighting on the battlefield, women were rendered powerless, often witnessing the destruction of their families and homes. Their vulnerability made them prime targets for the Vikings' most unspeakable practices. Historical sources, including Anglo-Saxon chronicles and Scandinavian sagas, provide chilling accounts of the treatment of women in the aftermath of Viking raids. While some sagas romanticize Viking life, they do not shy away from depicting the harsh realities of war. Women were considered spoils, a commodity that could be bartered, sold, or kept by warriors for personal purposes. The distinction between a wife, daughter, or a female relative of a slain or captured man mattered little. In the context of conquest, their value lay in their ability to serve as laborers, concubines, or hostages to guarantee compliance from surviving men. These actions were rarely questioned within Viking society itself. The societal norms of the time condoned such practices as part of the spoils of war. Archaeological evidence supports these grim historical accounts. Excavations in areas known to have been raided often reveal signs of abrupt abandonment, mass graves, and skeletal remains that suggest violent deaths. In some cases, DNA and burial analysis indicate the movement of women far from their places of origin, consistent with practices of forced relocation or enslavement. The treatment of women wasn't merely incidental to the raids, it was a calculated aspect of conquest. By taking women as captives, Vikings could destabilize entire communities, eroding the social fabric and asserting dominance over defeated populations. The psychological dimension of these raids cannot be overstated. Survivors often recount trauma not only from the physical destruction, but from the social upheaval caused by the loss of family members and community structures. Women who were taken captive faced a future that was unrecognizable from their previous lives. In many cases, they were integrated into Viking households, either as thralls, essentially slaves, or as concubines. Their agency was stripped away, and their fates were determined by the whims of their captors. Chroniclers sometimes note the despair and hopelessness of these women, though the accounts tend to focus more on the moral outrage of observers than on the lived experiences of the captives themselves. Nonetheless, the enduring impact on these communities was profound. as the loss of women not only represented a personal tragedy for families, but also disrupted the social continuity of villages, clans, and kinship networks. The brutality of Viking raids also had long-term political implications. By taking women captive, Vikings could forge alliances or manipulate political dynamics. Hostages were sometimes exchanged to secure the loyalty of local leaders, or women were married off to consolidate Viking control over newly conquered territories. These strategies illustrate that the violence was not random chaos, but rather a calculated tool of conquest designed to assert power, control resources, and ensure compliance. For the women involved, however, these political maneuvers often meant a life of subjugation, forced labor, or sexual exploitation, leaving scars that extended far beyond the immediate violence of the raid itself. It is essential to understand that while Vikings were feared for their ferocity, their treatment of women during raids was part of a broader pattern observed in many warrior societies of the medieval world. However, what sets Viking raids apart is the combination of speed, surprise, and the systematic targeting of women as spoils of war. The efficiency with which they executed these attacks made them both terrifying and effective. Communities could be devastated in a single day, leaving survivors to grapple with the loss of family, property, and autonomy. The unspeakable horrors inflicted upon women during these raids were not just a byproduct of war. They were central to the Vikings' methods of asserting dominance and control over conquered peoples. In conclusion, the brutal reality of Viking raids was a combination of strategic warfare, opportunistic plunder, and calculated terror. While men faced death in battle, women bore a different kind of suffering, one that was deeply personal, enduring, and often silenced in historical narratives. They were kidnapped, enslaved, and subjected to forms of violence that were normalized within the context of Viking conquest. Understanding this aspect of Viking history challenges the romanticized image of these seafaring warriors, revealing a society that, beneath its adventurous veneer, engaged in practices that were cruel and dehumanizing. The raids were not just about territory or wealth, they were about asserting control, and the treatment of women was central to that strategy. By examining these realities, we gain a clearer, if harrowing, understanding of the human cost of Viking expansion and the enduring trauma experienced by the wives and daughters of defeated enemies. In the brutal calculus of Viking warfare, women were not incidental casualties. They were prized possessions, considered essential spoils of conquest. While men could be killed or ransomed, women were often seized for their labor, sexual use, or political leverage. The systematic abduction of women during Viking raids was rooted in social norms, economic incentives, and the broader strategy of destabilizing enemy communities. Understanding this grim aspect of Viking culture requires examining the raids themselves, the societal context, and the personal consequences for the women who became unwilling captives. Vikings viewed warfare as a multi-dimensional enterprise. It was not simply about territorial conquest or resource acquisition. It was a means of asserting dominance, exacting revenge, and gaining status. Men gained honor through combat, while the acquisition of women reinforced social hierarchies and demonstrated a warrior's prowess. Sagas and chronicles from the period often depict women as tangible rewards for bravery and military success, much like land, livestock, or treasure. This objectification of women was embedded in the social fabric of Viking society. A male warrior's ability to acquire and control women was a symbol of his strength, skill, and social rank. The process of taking women as spoils began during the initial stages of a raid. Once a village or settlement was overwhelmed, men were either killed or captured, leaving women exposed. The Vikings frequently targeted women for immediate seizure, recognizing their vulnerability. In some cases, young and unmarried women were abducted outright. Older women could be taken to serve as laborers within Viking households. Chronicles describe entire families being dismantled, with women separated from husbands and children, sometimes permanently. The shock and fear generated by these abductions were deliberate. They ensured that survivors would submit to Viking authority and discouraged future resistance. Once captured, women faced a grim spectrum of fates, all dictated by the captor's preferences or the economic and political value of the victims. Some women were kept as concubines, forcibly integrated into the households of their captors. Others were sold into slavery, known as thralls, and transported far from their homes to work on farms, in households, or even in Viking markets. Slavery was an accepted institution in Norse society, and women were considered prime commodities because they could provide labor, bear children, and serve sexual purposes. In some accounts, women were taken as part of ransom deals, exchanged for goods, political favors, or the release of captured male relatives. The transactional nature of these abductions underscores the lack of agency afforded to women, who were treated less as human beings and more as bargaining chips in a violent world. Historical and literary sources provide insight into the psychological and social mechanisms that facilitated the abduction of women. The Icelandic sagas, while sometimes romanticized, contain numerous references to women being taken during raids. In Jarl's saga, for instance, women are described as being carried off during conflicts, with their captors displaying them as trophies of war. Similarly, Anglo-Saxon chronicles recount Viking raids on coastal towns where women were abducted en masse, emphasizing the terror these incursions inflicted on local populations. These accounts are not merely anecdotal, they reflect a pattern in which the seizure of women was a normalized aspect of military operations, sanctioned by both custom and necessity. The abduction of women had profound and lasting consequences for their lives. Once taken, their autonomy was stripped away, and they were subjected to the whims of their captors. Those kept as concubines faced forced sexual relationships, often under threat of violence. Women sold as thralls were required to perform grueling labor, from farming and cooking to weaving and child-rearing, while living under harsh conditions with little recourse. The psychological trauma was immense. Many women were separated from their families permanently, unable to return home and forced to adapt to a foreign culture and language. In some cases, women bore children fathered by their captors, further complicating their identity and sense of belonging. The loss of control over their own bodies and destinies created a legacy of suffering that extended far beyond the initial raid. The strategic use of women as spoils also had broader political implications. By seizing women, Vikings could undermine enemy societies, disrupt familial and social structures, and exert long-term influence over conquered populations. For instance, taking the wives or daughters of local leaders could be a means of coercion, ensuring that the men who survived the raids would remain compliant. Marriages arranged between captives and Viking warriors could also cement alliances, creating complex networks of loyalty and dependence that benefited the conquerors. In this sense, the treatment of women was not purely a matter of personal desire or brutality. It was a calculated tactic to reinforce Viking power and destabilize enemy communities. Despite the ubiquity of these practices, some women attempted to resist, though their options were limited. Historical accounts and sagas describe instances where women sought to escape, hide, or negotiate with captors. Resistance could be dangerous, often resulting in punishment or execution, but it demonstrates the agency that women exercised even in the face of extreme oppression. Tragically, for most women, survival meant submission, adapting to a new life imposed by their captors, navigating a social hierarchy that marginalized them, and enduring the physical and emotional toll of their circumstances. The legacy of these practices extends into the modern understanding of Viking society. Popular culture often portrays Vikings as adventurous, noble explorers or fearsome warriors, but the systematic abduction and subjugation of women highlight the darker realities of their conquests. Women's experiences were central to the outcomes of Viking raids, shaping the social, economic, and political dynamics of both the conquered and the conquerors. Recognizing this aspect of Viking history challenges romanticized notions of the Viking Age, forcing us to confront the human cost of these raids and the suffering endured by the wives and daughters of defeated enemies. Archaeological evidence further corroborates these historical accounts. Studies of Viking-era settlements and burial sites reveal signs of sudden displacement and forced migration, consistent with large-scale abductions. Artifacts, such as personal jewelry and household items found far from their place of origin, suggest that women and children were transported across regions, sometimes spanning hundreds of miles. Such findings provide tangible proof of the mobility imposed on captives and the disruption of their original communities. In addition, DNA analysis of some burial sites indicates the integration of foreign women into Viking populations, often corresponding with historical records of abductions and forced marriages. These archaeological insights reinforce the view that women's capture was not incidental but an integral component of Viking expansion and conquest. In conclusion, the treatment of women as spoils of war during Viking raids represents one of the darkest aspects of the Viking Age. They were seized, traded, enslaved, and exploited, with their fates dictated by violence, social norms, and political expedience. The abduction of women served multiple purposes. It reinforced social hierarchies within Viking society, destabilized enemy communities, and provided labor and sexual gratification to captors. For the women themselves, the consequences were devastating, stripping them of autonomy, exposing them to violence, and fracturing their familial and social bonds. By examining this grim reality, we gain a deeper understanding of the human cost of Viking raids, challenging the romanticized image of Vikings as merely adventurous seafarers, and illuminating the suffering endured by the wives and daughters of defeated enemies in the aftermath of a Viking raid. The fate of captured women often extended far beyond the initial violence. While the immediate horrors of abduction and separation from family were traumatic, many women were subsequently integrated into Viking households as enslaved individuals, or thralls, subjected to lives of relentless labor, social subjugation, and sometimes sexual exploitation. Enslavement was not incidental. It was a deliberate institution within Viking society, central to both their economy and social hierarchy. Understanding what life was like for women in these circumstances offers crucial insight into the human cost of Viking expansion and the suffering endured by those who became unwilling participants in this system. The institution of slavery in Norse society was deeply entrenched, legally sanctioned, and widely accepted. Captured women were among the most valuable commodities in this system. Unlike male captives, whose primary value often lay in their ability to fight or be ransomed, women were prized for their versatility. They could perform domestic labor, bear children, and serve as concubines or even wives. The differentiation between these roles was fluid and often dependent on the circumstances of capture, the status of the captor, and the perceived value of the captive. In many cases, a woman's entire identity and agency were erased upon entering a Viking household, replaced by a function defined by servitude or sexual exploitation. Daily life for enslaved women was harsh, regimented, and physically demanding. Thralls were expected to contribute labor in multiple spheres of the household and farm. This could include tending livestock, planting and harvesting crops, processing food, weaving textiles, and cleaning. Tasks were repetitive, exhausting, and often conducted under strict supervision. Failure to comply or underperformance could result in physical punishment. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements, such as wear patterns on tools and household implements, supports the existence of labor-intensive routines that were disproportionately assigned to women. In addition to physical toil, enslaved women were responsible for sustaining the household itself, preparing meals, and tending to the needs of their captors' families. The expectation was not merely functional, it reinforced the power dynamics between captor and captive, constantly reminding the women of their subjugated position. Beyond labor, the social hierarchy within Viking households placed enslaved women at the lowest tier. They had little to no autonomy, limited rights, and were subject to the authority of the household head or male family members. In some households, enslaved women could be married to lower-status men or other thralls. But even these unions did not confer freedom or security. Their legal standing was minimal. The law primarily recognized the rights and property of free men, Women's children born into enslavement often inherited the same status, perpetuating a cycle of subjugation. This system created an environment in which women were commodified, their value measured by labor output, reproductive potential, and obedience rather than by individuality or personal dignity. Sexual exploitation was another grim reality for many enslaved women. Concubinage, forced marriages, and sexual abuse were common features of life in Viking households. Some historical accounts and sagas reference concubines taken due ring raids, who were expected to bear children for their captors. While specific details are often obscured or euphemized in the historical record, the pattern is consistent. Women were subjected to sexual violence as a normalized aspect of their enslavement. For many women, this abuse had lifelong consequences, including physical trauma, social stigma, and the complex dynamics of bearing children fathered by captors. Children born in these circumstances could be raised within the household, further entrenching the power of the captors and complicating the women's sense of identity and belonging. Resistance, while perilous, was not entirely absent. Some women attempted to escape, hide, or resist their captors in subtle ways. Though these efforts were fraught with danger, escape attempts could result in violent punishment or even death. Others resisted through small acts of defiance, refusing tasks, undermining household routines, or maintaining connections to their cultural and familial identity. In rare instances, enslaved women might be ransomed or reclaimed by surviving relatives or political allies, but such outcomes were exceptions rather than the rule. The overwhelming reality was that the structure of Viking households systematically constrained women's freedom, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. The cultural context of Norse society also shaped the experiences of enslaved women. While modern perspectives might view such treatment as abhorrent, within the societal norms of the Viking Age, slavery was an accepted institution, and the capture and use of women in households were considered legitimate practices. Legal codes, such as those recorded in Iceland and Norway, provided frameworks for the ownership, treatment, and trading of thralls, including women. These laws regulated aspects of labor, punishment, and transactions, but offered little protection to the enslaved. The system institutionalized power imbalances and normalized the treatment of women as property rather than autonomous individuals. Understanding this context is crucial. The brutality was not only physical, but embedded in societal structures that legitimized subjugation. The psychological and emotional toll on enslaved women was immense. Separation from family, the loss of community, and the stripping of personal autonomy created enduring trauma. Many were forced to navigate an environment in which every action was controlled, where survival depended on compliance and obedience. Some women attempted to adapt, learning the language and customs of their captors, forming bonds with other thralls, or seeking small spaces of personal agency. Others were crushed under the weight of continuous labor, social isolation, and the threat of abuse. Their identities were reshaped by necessity, survival, and imposed roles, leaving indelible marks on their lives and, in some cases, the communities into which they were forcibly integrated. Enslaved women were also integral to the economic strategies of Viking households. They were considered assets whose labor increased productivity, and their offspring, if raised within the household, added to the future workforce. The trading of female captives was a lucrative enterprise, with markets in which women were bought and sold, often over vast distances. Historical records from Anglo-Saxon England and the European continent document the transport of captives as far as Scandinavia and even into parts of the Mediterranean. These movements illustrate the commodification of women and the transnational dimension of their subjugation, highlighting how individual suffering was intertwined with broader economic and social systems. Yet, despite the pervasive oppression, enslaved women were not entirely without influence within their constrained environments. Some could exercise limited authority over domestic spaces, supervise other thralls, or leverage relationships within the household to secure small privileges. In rare circumstances, enslaved women might gain freedom through manumission, marriage, or other social arrangements, though such outcomes were uncommon. These exceptions, however, do not diminish the overwhelming reality of subjugation, nor the fact that the system relied on constant control, labor exploitation, and the deprivation of personal autonomy to function effectively. In conclusion, the lives of enslaved women in Viking households were defined by labor, subjugation, and the denial of autonomy. Enslavement extended the violence of Viking raids far beyond the battlefield, transforming the lives of captured women into instruments of household economy and social hierarchy. From domestic work and sexual exploitation to the psychological toll of captivity, the experiences of these women illuminate the broader human cost of Viking expansion. Their suffering was not incidental, it was integral to the functioning of Viking society and a deliberate extension of the conquest and domination that began with the raids themselves. By examining the daily realities, legal structures, and cultural norms that underpinned enslavement, we gain a more comprehensive understanding of the extreme hardships endured by the wives, daughters, and women captured during Viking incursions. These were not merely collateral victims of war, they were central to the strategy, economy, and social organization of the Viking world. Among the most harrowing aspects of Viking raids was the sexual violence inflicted upon women, particularly the wives and daughters of defeated enemies. While pillaging and killing were central to the Viking strategy of conquest, the deliberate targeting of women for sexual exploitation was both a tool of power and a manifestation of deeply entrenched social norms. Sexual violence in this context was not random or incidental. It was systematic, culturally sanctioned, and had profound long-term consequences for the survivors, their families, and the communities from which they were taken. The abduction of women during raids often led directly to sexual exploitation. Young women were particularly vulnerable. Their perceived value was amplified by age and physical condition, as they were considered more desirable for concubinage, forced marriage, or sexual servitude. Historical chronicles, including Anglo-Saxon and Frankish sources, repeatedly mention the capture of women for such purposes. Women were often separated from their families immediately upon capture, leaving them isolated and without protection. This isolation magnified their vulnerability and underscored the power imbalance between captor and captive. The act of seizing women was itself a statement of dominance. It humiliated enemy men, disrupted social structures, and asserted control over the conquered population. Concubinage was one of the most common forms of sexual exploitation. Women captured during raids could be forced into long-term relationships with their captors, sometimes living within the household for years under coercion. These women were often compelled to bear children fathered by their captors, which had social, political, and economic implications. In a patriarchal society such as the Viking one, these children could be absorbed into the household, inheriting the status and privileges of the father, while effectively erasing the maternal lineage in terms of social standing. For the women themselves, this was a devastating reality. The forced sexual relationships stripped them of autonomy and subjected them to ongoing trauma, both physical and psychological. Forced marriages were another mechanism of control. In some cases, Viking warriors would marry the daughters or wives of defeated leaders as a way to legitimize conquest or establish political alliances. Such unions were rarely consensual. They were arranged to consolidate power, secure loyalty, or integrate newly conquered territories into the Viking sphere. The women involved had little to no say in these arrangements, and their marriages could last for life, with significant social and cultural implications. Even if a woman's marriage to a Viking warrior conferred certain protections or material advantages, it came at the cost of personal freedom, family separation, and subjugation to the authority of a captor who had initially taken her by force. Rape, often repeated and unrelenting, was a pervasive feature of Viking raids and the lives of captive women. Sexual assault served multiple purposes. It terrorized communities, punished the defeated, and asserted dominance over individuals. The fear of sexual violence extended beyond the immediate victims. It affected entire communities, as women were primary targets during attacks, leaving surviving families traumatized and disempowered. Chroniclers sometimes depict this violence graphically, emphasizing both the physical brutality inflicted and the psychological devastation it caused. Women who survived repeated assaults faced not only immediate injury, but also the long-term consequences of trauma, social stigma, and the potential for forced pregnancy. The consequences of sexual violence were deeply intertwined with social and familial disruption. Women who bore children as a result of rape or forced unions faced complex social realities. These children could be integrated into the captor's household, often with little acknowledgement of their maternal heritage. In other cases, women were forced to raise these children while continuing to perform labor and service for their captors. The emotional toll of bearing a child under coercion, coupled with the loss of family and homeland, created long-lasting psychological scars. Additionally, such unions could complicate future relationships and social reintegration, particularly if the woman were later ransomed or returned to her original community. Sexual violence also functioned as a broader tool of social control. By targeting women, Vikings could destabilize families and communities, undermining traditional structures of kinship and inheritance. The abduction or assault of wives and daughters left surviving men in vulnerable positions, often forced to negotiate with their captors for ransom or submit to Viking authority to protect what remained of their families. In this way, sexual violence was not merely personal, it was strategic, reinforcing Viking dominance over entire populations and communities. The systematic nature of this exploitation demonstrates that such acts were woven into the very fabric of Viking warfare and conquest, rather than being isolated incidents of opportunistic cruelty. The psychological impact of sexual violence on women was profound and enduring. Survivors often endured chronic trauma, anxiety, and depression. They faced the challenge of navigating a hostile environment where resistance could be met with further abuse or death. Many women were forced to adopt coping mechanisms, such as compliance, concealment of identity, or the suppression of cultural practices, to survive within the households of their captors. Over time, some were able to form new social bonds within their forced communities, but the shadow of the violence they endured remained a defining feature of their lives. Historical narratives, though often silent about the intimate details of suffering, acknowledge the lasting consequences of these experiences on both individuals and communities. Archaeological and textual evidence also sheds light on the widespread nature of sexual violence. Burial sites and skeletal remains from Viking-era settlements show evidence of women who experienced trauma consistent with assault and forced labor. Artifacts and household items suggest that captive women were integrated into domestic spaces, often performing both labor and sexual duties. Moreover, sagas, annals, and law codes from the period indicate that the capture and exploitation of women were common enough to be codified and socially accepted, highlighting the systemic nature of the practice. These sources collectively underscore that sexual violence was not a peripheral aspect of Viking raids, but a central component of conquest, with tangible social, economic, and psychological effects. The consequences of this violence extended beyond the immediate victims. Entire communities suffered from the destabilization wrought by raids and the targeting of women. Families were fractured, traditional social hierarchies were disrupted, and cultural continuity was threatened. Women's absence or subjugation had ripple effects, influencing labor distribution, family formation, and the transmission of cultural knowledge. In some cases, the integration of captured women into Viking households led to the blending of cultures, though this was often coerced rather than voluntary. The enduring legacy of these practices can be traced through genealogical, cultural, and historical records, demonstrating how the impact of sexual violence reverberated across generations. In conclusion, sexual violence was a central, deliberate, and devastating aspect of Viking raids. The abduction, rape, forced marriage, and concubinage of women were tools of domination, used to assert power over both individuals and communities. For the victim, the consequences were profound, encompassing physical injury, psychological trauma, social displacement, and the complex realities of raising children under coercion. Beyond individual suffering, these practices destabilized societies, disrupted familial structures, and reinforced Viking dominance. By examining these brutal realities, we gain a fuller understanding of the human cost of Viking expansion, highlighting the suffering endured by the wives, daughters, and women of defeated enemies, whose stories, though often marginalized in historical narratives, remain a critical component of the Viking legacy. Violent treatment of women during Viking raids has left a complex and lasting legacy, both in historical records and in modern perceptions of Viking society. While earlier sections have detailed the brutal realities of abduction, sexual exploitation, and enslavement, it is crucial to examine how these practices were recorded, remembered, and interpreted over time. Historical accounts, sagas, chronicles, and archaeological evidence collectively provide a window into the scale and systemic nature of these acts, revealing not only the suffering of individual women, but also the broader social and cultural impact of Viking expansion. Much of what we know about Viking raids comes from contemporary sources outside Scandinavia, often written by those who suffered directly from Viking incursions. Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Frankish annals, and Irish records provide detailed descriptions of raids on coastal towns and river settlements, frequently highlighting the abduction of women as a hallmark of Viking aggression. For example, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recounts the repeated attacks on monasteries, towns, and villages, noting the capture of nuns, daughters, and wives. Such accounts emphasize the terror inflicted upon communities, portraying women as particularly vulnerable victims of violence. These sources, written by those who opposed the Vikings, naturally convey a perspective of horror and outrage, which offers invaluable insight into contemporary perceptions of these raids. Scandinavian sagas, composed slightly later, provide another layer of historical understanding, albeit with a blend of legend, oral tradition, and historical events. Sagas such as Eol's Saga, Laxdæla Saga, and Gisla Saga often depict the capture and forced marriage of women during conflicts, illustrating the normalized nature of these practices within Viking society. While the sagas sometimes romanticize or dramatize events, they are consistent in portraying women as both prized and powerless in the context of warfare. The narratives convey the dual reality of admiration for Viking warriors and the recognition of the harsh consequences their actions imposed upon the defeated, particularly women. Through these stories, we see not only the physical dangers, but also the social and psychological pressures experienced by captives. Archaeological evidence complements these textual sources and provides tangible proof of the impact of Viking raids on women and communities. Excavations in areas known to have been attacked often reveal signs of abrupt abandonment, destruction, and mass graves. Skeletal remains sometimes show trauma consistent with violence, including injuries indicative of assault or forced labor. Moreover, artifacts such as jewelry, domestic tools, and personal items found far from their original locations suggest the movement of women across regions consistent with abduction and relocation. DNA studies further confirm patterns of migration and integration of foreign women into Viking populations, highlighting the lasting social consequences of these raids. The combination of textual and material evidence underscores that the capture and exploitation of women were not peripheral phenomena, but central elements of Viking expansion. The legacy of these practices extends beyond the historical record into the realm of cultural memory. Over time, the Viking image in popular imagination has shifted dramatically, from feared raiders and ruthless conquerors to romanticized adventurers and noble explorers. This transformation, fueled by literature, art, and media, often obscures the human suffering inflicted during raids, particularly on women. While tales of heroic voyages, epic battles, and Viking mythology capture the imagination, the darker realities of abduction, sexual violence, and enslavement are frequently minimized or ignored. This selective memory has contributed to an incomplete understanding of the Viking Age, masking the social and personal costs of conquest. Understanding the treatment of women during Viking raids also illuminates broader patterns in medieval warfare. The deliberate targeting of women for abduction and exploitation was not unique to the Vikings, but was part of a larger pattern of medieval conflict, in which civilian populations often bore the brunt of violence. In this context, the Vikings' actions can be seen as a reflection of the era's norms and strategy of war, yet they also demonstrate the particular efficiency and ruthlessness with which the Vikings executed these practices. By comparing historical accounts of Viking raids with other contemporary societies, we gain perspective on both the uniqueness and the universality of the trauma inflicted on women in times of war. The consequences of these actions were profound and multifaceted. For individual women, the immediate impact included physical injury, sexual trauma, forced labor, and the loss of family and community. For families and communities, the abduction and subjugation of women disrupted social structures, weakened social cohesion, and introduced long-term instability. Children born to captive women often grew up in foreign households, reshaping familial lineages and social networks. These consequences were not confined to the Viking Age. They influenced the demographics, culture, and social organization of affected regions for generations. In this sense, the raids had enduring effects on population structures, inheritance practices, and cultural transmission. Legal codes from the Viking and post-Viking period further reflect the centrality of women in the aftermath of raids. Norse law recognized the status of thralls, including rules governing ownership, punishment, and manumission. Women captives were integrated into these legal structures, which regulated their labor, reproductive roles, and social standing, often to their detriment. In some cases, laws allowed for the protection or redemption of captives, but these were exceptions, and the overarching system privileged the captor's authority. The codification of such practices into law demonstrates how deeply entrenched the exploitation of women was within Viking society, transforming acts of conquest into systemic and regulated components of social life. The cultural and historical legacy of these practices extends to how we study and interpret the Viking Age today. Modern historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists examine these raids not only to understand the Vikings themselves, but also to reconstruct the experiences of those who suffered under their rule. Women's stories, often overlooked in traditional narratives, are increasingly recognized as central to understanding the social, economic, and political dynamics of the period. This focus provides a more nuanced and realistic depiction of Viking society, challenging romanticized or simplified portrayals and acknowledging the human cost of conquest and expansion. Finally, the legacy of sexual violence and enslavement during Viking raids also resonates in the broader context of human history. It serves as a stark reminder of the ways in which war has historically exploited women, using their bodies as instruments of power and control. By studying these historical patterns, scholars and readers gain insight into both the continuity and the change in gendered violence across time and space. The experiences of women during the Viking Age highlight the need to integrate marginalized perspectives into historical narratives, ensuring that the full spectrum of human experience, including suffering, resilience, and survival, is acknowledged. In conclusion, the historical accounts and legacy of the treatment of women during Viking raids reveal a society in which conquest, abduction, and exploitation were deeply intertwined with social, economic, and political structures. Textual sources, sagas, and archaeological evidence collectively document the systematic targeting of women, the normalization of sexual violence and enslavement, and the long-term consequences for individuals and communities. While popular imagination often romanticizes Viking life, the historical record emphasizes the profound human cost of the sea raids, particularly for the wives, daughters, and female relatives of defeated enemies. By examining this evidence, we gain a more complete understanding of the Viking Age, acknowledging both the power and the cruelty of its warriors and the enduring suffering of those who were caught in the wake of their expansion.